I have an article that I published in African Arts in the spring of 2013 called Soulful Stitching. So it's about the quilt specifically, and you'll see more examples here. But today I'm going to focus on the one example that I brought for you to look at and touch and feel and examine as the talk goes on. Thanks, Lalita. Thanks, Ukoya. Well, I hope this is your finale for the semester. I hope it is a grand one. I'll do my best. My talk today is going to be in two parts. In the first part, I'll give this brief historical overview of the presence of African people in the Indian Ocean and in South Asia since the first millennium of our era, when they came as merchants, traders, sailors, entrepreneurs, traveling mostly from the Horn of Africa, what is today Ethiopia and Somalia, across the Indian Ocean and back and forth to the early ports along the West Indian coast like Cambay and Dieu. That's one history. Soon after, that is essentially from the 12th century on, Africans get caught up in the East Indian Ocean trade and military expeditions by various Islamic empires, most notably the Mughals in South Asia and their presence. And they come as conscripted. They are enslaved, but they're enslaved in a very different way from the way they become enslaved in the Atlantic world by the Europeans. Slave trade in the Indian Ocean is older, not as extensive, and very, very different. And large numbers of Africans come as a result of this historical situation, where they go into slave markets and are recruited by powerful individuals in this Islamic world to become professional soldiers, warriors, because they have a reputation for courage, for strength, and for loyalty. Those attributes are what make them perfect for the Mughal armies in the expansion of Islam into South Asia. As Amitav Ghosh explains, we need to understand slavery in the Indian Ocean world as more a relationship between patrons and clients and not masters and slaves. Because to be recruited into the Mughal armies was a way to advance one's career. And many of the Africans who were recruited become admirals of navies. They become generals and of armies. They enter the political sultanates that are established in South Asia, where they serve as prime ministers, as advisors to sultans and nawabs. And some of them become rulers, like the most famous one that I will talk about in the talk, from the Deccan area, Malik Ambar, who ruled for 26 years and beat all of his enemies, including the Marathis, the Portuguese, the British, and anyone else who tried to take over his territory. But he was not only a military leader, he was a civic leader, and I'm going to show you some of the things that he has contributed, things that still remain today in that part of the Deccan. So this is this first part of the talk, this history of Africans as elites and as independent players in the Indian Ocean world from the first millennium through to the 16th and 17th century. The second half of my talk is a very different history, where the Portuguese become involved in and trying to compete with the Arabs in the Indian Ocean trade in human beings, and they introduce European forms of slavery. They enslave Africans from the southeast coast of Africa, primarily from the area now Mozambique, but probably also Tanzania, through Zanzibar and through Madagascar. And they're bringing smaller numbers of Africans, enslaving them. These are the Portuguese, bring the Africans to the center of their Indian Ocean growing economic empire, that is to Goa on the west coast of India. So Africans from southeastern Africa, enslaved by the Portuguese, brought to Goa, mostly for domestic service, because this is a city, a kind of urban area with very powerful Portuguese merchants who need their entourage of servants to serve them. And there isn't a plantation system, so the numbers are not large, but significant. And over time, those Africans escape bondage in Goa. They go into the interior of the Western Ghat Mountains, where they can't be recaptured, and they set up independent communities in the forests of the Western Ghat Mountains. So they essentially are doing exactly what happens in the Atlantic world in a number of places, with the maroon communities of Jamaica, of Cuba, of Puerto Rico, of Mexico. The cimarrones in the Atlantic world are happening also in the Indian Ocean world by these Africans who escape bondage, create their own independent communities in the Western Ghat Mountains, and gradually, over several generations, this is since the 16th century, moves further south into what is now the state of Karnataka, where they number probably about 20 to 25,000 people in small villages scattered in northern Karnataka. Okay? So that's the voyage that we'll be taking today. Just to orient you in space, I've talked about the place where most of those Siddis that went to Goa came from, either through Madagascar or directly to the west coast of India. But the earlier Africans who were part of the Islamic expansion coming from Ethiopia and from Somalia. The Deccan, that's the area that I have darkened in the map. So kind of south-central India. This is where the Mughal expansion from North India comes to this farthest southern extent, between about the 14th, 15th, 16th century and into the 17th century as well. And it's in the expansion, the military expansion into this area of the Deccan, that Africans, known as Siddi, S-I-D-I or S-I-D-D-I, are crucial to those military expansions and establishments because they are the troops and they are the leaders of those troops. And they get recognized because we have a history of portraits of a number of these Siddi noblemen in the Deccani miniature painting tradition. And we're going to be going to Ahmednagar, which is where Malik Ambar was established, and it was this area that he controlled. I'm also going to be taking you to a place about 90 miles south of Bombay or Mumbai, to one of the finest marine forts on the west coast of India, called Janjira. It's an incredible structure. It was controlled by the Siddis, sailors, admirals who controlled the Navy for more than 300 years, up until the early 19th century, and it was occupied up until the middle of the 20th century. And I'll show you some pictures of that. But I want to start with this wonderful portrait of a Siddis nobleman. Ikhlis Khan, we think it is. He was a prime minister. He was a nobleman in one of the sultanates. He was an important court official and advisor to rulers. He was probably an incredible warrior. But what I love is the fact that he's holding this rose. So he was probably also a poet. He was an intellectual. He wasn't just a warrior. He had his power not only in his muscles, but in his mind. And these are the kinds of images and portraits that we have of these African noblemen. You should know that there is an exhibition of many of these miniature paintings of African nobles in India, along with the Siddis quilts. That's currently at the Afro-American Museum in Philadelphia. So if you get to the East Coast, that exhibition is going to be up until the end of January, I think. Here is said to be the portrait of Malik Ambar. Malik Ambar, who ruled Ahmednagar from 1600 to 1626. 1600 to 1626. 26 years of battling to maintain his realm. He became the effective ruler of that sultanate during that time. He was credited with developing the earliest forms of guerrilla warfare to defeat his enemies. So he was a military genius. He was seen as a military genius. But he was also an important civic leader because he built several mosques in the city, and the city gate that you see on the left, and the main mosque interior on the right, two of his monuments. He also created a complex system of aqueducts and water coursing systems for the supply of water to the city of Ahmednagar, built during his reign in the 17th century, that's still in use today in that city. He built the main marketplace, a civic center for the city of Ahmednagar, and this is his tomb. He is buried at Kulibat with all of the other major Mughal rulers of the era. And his wife also has a comparable tomb, but this is his. It's an incredible structure. It's the same as the tombs, the glorious tombs of the other Mughal rulers from that particular period. And I think it demonstrates quite dramatically the status and the presence and the power of these African noblemen during the era. Well, I guess I took out Janjira, so I guess you're not going to see this marvelous fort. But if I can find it on my computer, I'll bring it up later if anybody wants to see it. It was a wooden fort. It's off the coast, just off the coast by about a half a mile. So it's an island fort whose moat was the sea, as it was described. That's why it was impregnable, because during high tide it was separated by about a half a mile of water. At low tide, still separated by the sea. The Siddis changed that wooden fort into an incredible stone fort that at its height had occupants of, I think, about 1,500 people lived in the garrison city that was in that fort. It has an incredible tower lookout tower. It has a huge tank that supplied its water so that it could survive sieges over a long period of time. And the Siddhi rulers of Janjira were the people who were in charge of guarding the Indian Ocean waters, and especially the routes of pilgrimage for Muslims going to Mecca. They were the ones who protected the ships going back and forth. They were also the major suppliers of Arabian horses back and forth. So they had a very powerful and important presence. All right, let me move on to the second half of my talk. The history of the Siddis who were brought by the Portuguese, enslaved by the Portuguese and brought to Goa since the 16th century, and who probably end of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century started migrating, claiming their freedom and migrating into the interior and further south into the state of Karnataka. Panjim is the capital at Goa. So here we are in Goa, where the Portuguese enclave was. They go into the interior to the mountains that run as a rib along the coast here, into the mountain areas, heavily forested, dense, impenetrable, create and carve out communities in those forests, and then move south into this area of northern Karnataka. Okay? Okay. All right, so now we're moving to Karnataka. You see it after monsoon rains. These are some of the rice paddy areas, just to give you a sense of the environment that they live in. When they moved into the Western Ghat mountains and forests, nobody messed with them. And they were able to develop their independent communities, essentially becoming agriculturalists and surviving that way, and engaging in trade with other local indigenous peoples, tribal peoples like the Gaudi and the Lambani, who live in that part of northern Karnataka. But they kept pretty much to themselves, and they were allowed to live and flourish. However, with the coming of Indian independence in the 20th century, that situation changes, because then the Indian government is beginning to establish national forests, national reserves. And the areas that the Siddis settled in are then become the purview of the Democrats, the bureaucrats, not the Democrats, the bureaucrats. Yeah, maybe they're Republicans, who knows? I haven't checked. But in any case, they're the ones who begin to control the forest areas as a natural resource, and the policy is that anybody who lives in those national forests are subject to those rules and regulations, and sometimes must leave. So it's put pressure on the Siddis, even though they developed the land, built their communities. Many of them have been forced out of the now defined forests, national forests, so they're on the edge of those forests. And this rice field that you're looking at is right on the edge of one of them, where they originally had communities within the forest, are now at the edge of the forest. Here are two Siddhi young men with a domestic cow. The more prosperous Siddhi families are able to purchase domestic animals, goats and cows and chickens. Most of them have very small plots of land, not large, and the land that they worked has been bought up by rich landlords, landowners in cahoots with government officials who accept their bribes willingly. And so it's become a difficult situation for the Siddis, but they managed to survive. This was a photograph of a typical Siddhi home in around 2000. 2001 was the first year that I I met this community and lived in this community, and then was back again in 2004. And I think this photograph is from 2001. So thatched roofs, a kind of adobe structure using bamboo for the walls. The fenced-in area that you see is their plot, their garden, and clothes drying in the sun. This is what Sydney houses are looking like these days. There was a government scheme to give them money to improve, put that in quotes, to improve their houses. And so they were given a certain amount of money to build a house. However, the money that was given to them wasn't enough to actually build the house. And before they were given the money, they had to demolish their present primitive house. All right? So they got caught up in this government scheme that was supposed to help them and improve their housing, but in fact, it made living much more difficult for those communities. Because then, with the money that they were given, they had to go to certain suppliers of building materials who were the friends of the government officials in that area. So you know what happened next. Doubled the price. So many of them struggled to rebuild their homes. They were built in adobe style, thick walls, veranda on the front, or a porch on the front. The interiors of those houses were quite comfortable, especially in the hottest part of the year. They were efficient during the rainy monsoon season as well. But with the change in building materials, the houses are not necessarily better. But some of them succeeded, and this is one that's in the village of Mainole, where they have the tile roofs, but they had to pay an exorbitant amount of money for the tile roofs, and the front porch, and then there are interiors, and the kitchen area is in the back, as you will see. Here is Dungi. This is the grandmother whose family I lived with, where I first discovered the quilts, or the quilts discovered me. Because it was with that family that I was staying, and this was in 2004, and I was given the son's bedroom to sleep in because he was away looking for work. And I woke up the next morning to see what I was sleeping on. I was sleeping on one of these quilts, a larger size of this version. And it was a marvelous awakening. And then I started to see the quilts being dried in the sun all over the village, the Mainole, where I was staying, and started asking women about them. And this is a tradition that goes back very, very far. And it's mothers who are making them for their daughters or granddaughters at the time of a wedding or the birth of a child. So they were garments that are made from the remnants of clothing that could no longer be worn. So the women would collect these pieces of clothing, used clothing. They would also go to a weekly cloth market where there was a section for used clothing that they would buy a bundle of. When they had a sufficient number of pieces, then they would begin creating this quilt. Well, Dungi was a fine quilter and a leader within the community, as it happened, and that was just by chance. And so I started talking with her, and she talked with two of her close friends, and you will see them. Wait, let me just go back, and you'll see them working on the quilts when I come to that section, and I have to keep moving because I'm running out of time. Okay, so this is the backyard and the kitchen area where she's preparing food for us. This is that front room in the house. Now this is a reconstructed house, and they were fairly successful because they had funds of their own to put into completing the building. Most of the Siddis in this community in Mainole are Catholic or Christian because they came from Goa, so they were coming out of a Portuguese Catholic culture, and they continued that in Karnataka. And that's also reinforced because in this community, an Indian sisterhood, Catholic sisterhood, known as the Sisters of Mercy of the Holy Cross, have been working with them and other indigenous peoples for the last 25 years. And they have a health clinic in this village of Mainale. So the presence of a Catholic presence is a strong one in Mainale. The quilts, however, as we developed the cooperative, involved three communities. Mainale, primarily Catholic or Christian, a few Protestants now, but not many, and a few evangelicals, but mostly Catholic. A second community, Gunjavati, which is a mix of Catholic, Hindu, and Muslim, and Kendalgiri, which is primarily a Muslim community, Muslim Siddhi community, African Muslim community. So the women are coming from those three communities making the quilts. So this is the front room of the house that I stayed in. And it would be where they would have guests coming. You can see their domestic altar on the far wall. This was before the preparations for the marriage of George, the son who I displaced in his bedroom. He decided to come back and get married, and I lost my room. In any case, the front room of the house was transformed into this. I don't know if you can see this well enough, but that's the same room, but now there's an entertainment unit on that far wall, and there's lots of cut paper decorating the ceiling. This is in preparation for his wedding and the celebrations as a part of his wedding. There's also another element. I mean, he's got his sound system now, because there's going to be some serious dancing at this wedding. There's also a television set that has its screen covered with a cloth, because this house became the kind of local movie theater. They would rent movies from Mungud, the largest town, play them on the VCR, and then everybody would fill this room to watch movies on a regular basis. So it became a real kind of community center. The music and dance traditions are also of much interest to me. I'm hoping to go back and do some more work on that, because these are just as strong as the visual tradition of the quilts. You're looking at one of the Siddhi elders playing the damam, D-A-M-A-M, damam drum, which they believe is the drum that they brought with them from Africa, or recreated in India based upon its model in Africa. And damam is a kind of general term, and maybe Ed could also talk about this, but it's a kind of general term for the music and dance traditions of the Siddhis, whether Catholic or Muslim, especially those from Gujarat. I was showing you a clip of Siddhi Goma, which is a Siddhi performance group that actually came here to Madison a few years ago. We brought them and they performed in Union Theater. And they are Sufi. They are Sufi Muslims from Gujarat. And they also talk about some of their musical traditions at damam. So this is the drum. You see it resting on his feet, and he plays it on the two heads, both sides. And here is Flora, one of the finest quilters, doing her thing in the dance to the damam drum. Kind of rhythmic, slow gestures and movements. There are certain parts of the performance that are relatively slow and moderate in tempo, and others that are quite fast. Another tradition in the same community was this all-night singing by Muslim women, Muslim Siddhi women, celebrating the wedding of twins from a Muslim Siddhi family. And the woman in the center is playing this drum, which has, I think, strong connections to Oman and the Omanis, and that connection in this movement from the Horn of East Africa all the way to the west coast of India. And is part of this Islamic musical tradition in the broadest sense. And here is the perfect example of call and response, because she plays the drum and she sings the solo, and then the women who surround her do the call, the response to the call that she makes in her song. Okay, now final part is the making of these quilts. I'm going to focus on the quilt now. You're looking at Jocelyn, I think Jocelyn, I'm writing on her name. She's about to begin making one of these quilts. And the quilts come in different sizes. The largest is king size, or Raja quilt. Then there are the queen size quilts, the Rani quilts. And then there are the baby quilts. This is an example of a crib or baby quilt. And I'll show you how it's used within the household. So Jocelyn has collected scraps from the marketplace and from members of her family. They're in that basket in front of her, and she's beginning to sew. Now, one of the things that's really distinctive about the creation of these Siddis quilts is that the women start in one of the corners with these individual patches of cloth, and they work their way to the center. Almost every other quilting tradition, you do just the opposite. You start in the center and you work out to the edges. But that's not the way Siddis women make their quilts. And they do it with these heavy needles and cotton thread, and they're doing this running stitch that stitches these layers together. If they want to make a quilt for the monsoon, the cold rains of the monsoon season, they'll overlap the pieces of cloth more to thicken it. They don't put batting in the inside, but they just use for more layering. But if they want to make a thin one for the warm weather, for a baby or for themselves, then they'll just overlap it a little bit and keep it thin and choose thinner fabrics. But they're using all kinds of fabrics. Synthetic as well as cotton. Here is the first quilt that was made for the Quilting Cooperative. In conversation with the women in the community, they took the initiative to create this cooperative as a way for the women to earn money from the making of these quilts. I and another colleague of mine made contributions to the start of the cooperative. We paid the women for the making of the quilts. And then these quilts I bring to the States, or they send to me, and then I exhibit them and get an exhibition fee that goes back to the cooperative, and I sell them. So this one is available for, I'll give you a very good price. I have about 50 of them available. Most of them in baby quilt size now, because the larger ones are expensive and they're harder to move. And 30 of them are on exhibit at the African-American Museum in Philadelphia right now, and they've been selling some in their shop. So that was my advertisement. I can now, the commercial moment has now passed. So back to the quilts. So this, you're looking at them making the first quilt, and in the big family quilts, you know, the Rani and the Raja quilts would be made by 2 or 3 women working together. And this is the start of the one that they're doing, and they've each started at one of the corners and working toward the center. So this is maybe day 3 or day 4 of the making of this huge quilt. Here's a close-up of Dungi, who has now joined the heaven of other quilters, because she's now left us a year ago. So you see a detail of her working on this quilt. It takes a lot of strength, a lot of concentration. And it's not only the beautiful designs and patterns that they determine on the front, but the stitching at the back is also the signature of the quilter. And they're judged by how straight and how small the individual stitches are and how they relate to the overall form and movement of the quilt itself. So I find some of the backs of the quilts just as interesting as the front. Now, the baby quilts are used this way. You see a young mother with two of her children, a little baby on her lap, and her daughter next to her there. And on the right, you're seeing one of these hanging cribs that's suspended from the roof beams. And here's the crib itself, and it's filled and packed with these baby quilts. And then they use a thin sari fabric as a kind of mosquito netting to protect the kids from mosquito bites and malaria. And then these are, sung to and pushed to help the babies go to sleep. But when they wake up, Sindhi mothers want to make sure that their kids turn out to be lively. And so one of the reasons, I talked to them about the baby quilts, because the baby quilts are the ones that have the most complex patterns and designs, much more so than the big ones, which are using bigger patches of fabric. Here they'll take small pieces, little bits and pieces, brightly contrasting colors and shapes, because as one Sindhi mother explained to me, we want them to be bright, to keep them alive and attentive and excited about living. So here you see Fatima. Fatima has also now joined the ancestors. She was the leader in Kendalgiri in the Muslim community. She's inspecting one of the large quilts that she had woven. There you see it being worn on her head as she carries it to marketplace or to our meeting that day. Fatima was a powerful woman, and she organized the women to create the quilts and to help her community prosper. Here's an example of one of those large quilts, one of the first ones in that group from 2004. So you'll see something of the patterning. You'll also see these lots of little squares scattered throughout the quilt at various points. Those are known as tikli. I like to think of them as stars in the firmament, because they pop out in the design, and they give it a kind of liveliness. And especially in the baby quilts, it's those tikli that are multiplied in many ways throughout the composition. There's also this kind of chevron pattern that repeats in the corners of many of the quilts. And just looking back through some of my notes, I think I understand now why. They're conceiving of the making of a quilt like the building of the foundation of a house. And they have just been coming through this experience of rebuilding their homes from foundation back up. Where do you start? You start in the corners to define the corner of the foundation of the house. So that's I think, the reference here with these chevron motifs in the corner. This one that you're looking at is by Bibijan at Ekesur from Mainale. Then another thing that happens is when the women get close to the center, there's a kind of design flourish that happens. There's a special combination of colors and patterns, and this very dramatic kind of accent piece that just breaks the vertical and horizontal patterning here to attract your eye to the very center. And it seems as though there's a kind of intensified design consciousness there, and you see it here as well in this large quilt on the screen. There's another detail of that design flourish at the very center of a quilt. See how it's set apart from the panels of fabric that surround it. There's one other thing that I want to mention to you, and it's the last thing that's done. When a quilt is completed, they'll take small pieces of fabric, fold them 2 or 3 times, and then attach them at the corner. Every Sydney quilt will have this attachment at the corner. So I asked, well, why is that there? Because it really isn't serving any kind of function. And the city quilter that I talked to laughed at me, and she said, well, you know, you have to have those. They're called pula. Pula, or flower, the word for flower. The flower has to be there. Those forms have to be there. Because if we forgot to put them, the quilt would be naked. It's a concept of completeness, finishing it properly. And doing the flower at each of those corners makes it a proper quilt. And I leave you with this patchwork image of many of the quilters from the Cooperative, from the 3 villages that I work with, the women who create this beauty for us as well as for their families. Thank you.